Hey, welcome everybody. I am Mike Ritz, W7VO, and out here in beautiful rainy Scappoose, Oregon. And no, I'm not standing in front of the ARRL iconic W1AW. I'm actually sitting in my rather boring home office here in Scappoose, Oregon. I am also a ARRL director representing the Northwestern Division when I'm not busy giving presentations to nice group of folks here like RATPAC. So let's go ahead and talk about the storied history of the ham radio call sign. And this is a presentation that I did for QSO Today, Hamfest. I believe it was last March. And after they took it down, I put it up on my own YouTube channel and has since garnered almost 50,000 views in just a couple of months. So it's a little bit shorter version of what you're going to see here tonight. I had to keep it very short in order to fit it into the window required by Eric and the QSO Today guy. So this is a little bit more extended. You'll learn a little bit more than they did in that. So let's go ahead and get started. Every legal radio amateur in the world, all of us, have a government issued call sign. The question is, where did it all begin, right? Where did our call signs come from? So we're going to talk about the evolution of these, especially the U.S. Amateur radio call signs, starting with what I call the pioneer years, the years prior to 1918, the reconstructive years of 1918 to 1927, the pre-war years, 1927 till about World War II, the post-war years of post-World War II and up to 1975, and then the modern era, which is 1975 to now. So let's talk about the pioneer years here to start. And these are what I'm calling the Days of Anarchy. And why is it called the Days of Anarchy? Well, prior to 1912, there were absolutely no wireless regulations in the US at all. The closest thing you can come to that is what happened to CB radio in the 1970s, right? It was a free-for-all Great Western frontier as far as radio is concerned. The US policy, however, was really different than the rest of the world because in 1906, the International Radio Telegraph Convention, which was held in Berlin that year, called for countries to license stations. And they had sent some US delegation to there, they signed the treaty, but when they got back home again, the US Senate did not ratify the treaty. So really it was not enforced. The US kind of snubbed its nose at it saying, we'll get around to it, And typical, US politics, they didn't do anything. And so after that happened, the US was told, hey, don't get back until you guys agree to regulate. US amateurs, what they did is they pretty much made up their own call signs, first with just their names, and then later shortened to two or three letters or numbers. And of course, all this was in Morse code then, and most likely with spark gap, early crude spark gap transmitters. There we go. Oops, sorry. Let me back up here. Commercial and commercial land and shipboard stations, the commercial ones, also made up their own call signs, and they also used the same 2 or 3 letters. So there was a lot of overlap in call signs between commercial stations and amateur stations. And there was also reports of deliberate interference with the Navy stations, with amateurs sending ships on false missions. And of course, typical as for 20 or for 40 meters and 80 meters today, a lot of obscenities were being used. So there was a lot of consternation between the amateurs and the military users of radio at the time. Spark gap transmitters had very limited range, typically 75 to 200 miles. So it really didn't matter too much if there was a lot of overlap. Modern Electrics magazine in 1908 really published the first what you could almost call a call book of amateur stations in July of 1908. However, it really wasn't a complete listing because once again, there was no government activity at the time. They weren't involved in it. There wasn't a central database. And it, by the way, it cost you 10 cents to get your call sign listed in this list. So, but by the way, if you did pay the 10 cents, you got a free subscription to the magazine for a year. So there was an incentive for you to get your call sign in the book. So here are what I am calling the first 10 hams. And you can see you've got these are the first 10 hams that were listed in that particular call book. So here you've got the call sign of AU, It also shows the approximate wavelength in meters of their signal and about how long the spark was on their induction coil. So they actually measure what the spark gap is. Otto Curris here was Q. You know, maybe that was the first version of James Bond's Q. Who knows? MD, see, MD uses initials and et cetera, goes down the list here. So here are really the first 10 hams that were actually in print. By 1909, the Wireless Blue Book came out, and and you can see here that they, at that time, this was in July of 1909, and at that time they had, or June of 1909, they had about 972 stations in there, of which about 115 were amateur stations. Once again, you know, this was just a few years after 1906. There weren't a lot of hams, and once again, this list was not inclusive. You had to pay money to get it to get onto it. So here by May of 1909, the list had got a lot longer. This is just one page here, but you'll notice that a lot of the call signs that are being used have an M on the end of the call sign: RDM, KSM, JAM, HNM, and etc. And what those were stations who worked for a little company on the East Coast called Marconi, and that was to identify them as being Marconi employees. So when you worked another ham that had an M on the end of the call sign, you knew that he was a part of your brethren and was a fellow employee of the Marconi Corporation. You can also see there's some unconventional call signs down here. The Rochester Wireless Telephone Company had an amateur station that just used the letter H, and J.C. Randall down here is S4. You can just almost imagine an Abbott Costello routine, you know, based around that one. Well, what's your call sign? S4. Well, what's my signal? Well, yeah, you're S4. No, what's my call sign? Oh, it's S4. It just, you know, goes on. And then down here we got this guy in Renton, Washington, who was just 3B. On April 3rd, 1912, the U.S. The Senate finally got around to ratifying the treaty and decided to work on some legislation to implement what the rest of the world had adopted in 1906. And then on the 15th of April in 1912, this is just a few weeks after they ratified the treaty, all things for amateurs changed. And that was the sinking of the Titanic on the 15th of April of 1912. You say to yourself, well, what's the sinking of the Titanic have to do with amateur radio call signs? Well, the Titanic had a Marconi-owned wireless station to use the call sign of MGY. M was for Marconi. Non-Marconi-owned stations that were aboard other ships, and most of them had equipment made by a German manufacturer called Telefunken, didn't have to acknowledge them and sometimes didn't. In fact, Marconi had forbade his radio operators from communicating with other ships that were not Marconi-owned ships. You know, much like the laws of earlier, I forget what the name of the laws are, but anyway, you couldn't infringe and communicate with other ships, and that made a lot of problem when the Titanic began to sink. There were also a lot of unintentional and intentional interference with Titanic's distress signals. People just said, you know, that they didn't know what it was. They didn't believe that the Titanic was sinking, and therefore really didn't pay a lot of attention to it. There was also confusion over the fact that Marconi had commanded his radio operators use his CQ distress for an emergency signal, rather than what was adopted in 1906 at the convention, which was SOS. So Marconi operators ended up sending a combination of CQD and SOS just to get somebody to understand what the heck was happening with them. It was all over, as often happens. People get hauled in front of Congress, and Marconi is no exception. He had a lot of explaining to do to satisfy the U.S. congressional hearings that followed the sinking. And believe it or not, the U.S. followed up pretty quickly with some legislation. And that legislation was the Radio Act of 1912, enacted in July of 1912. It established a federal law that required ships to constantly monitor distress frequencies. So they had to have a radio set up that was listening to specified distress frequencies, so they wouldn't accidentally miss an SOS call. It mandated that all radio stations in the U.S. be licensed by the federal government, including amateurs. So this is the first time that amateurs are now required to get their stations licensed. And it limited hams to 200 meters of wavelength, about 1.5 megahertz, and lower, as literally it says in the text, frequencies higher are considered to be useless. So they really didn't think that anything higher than 1.5 megahertz was usable, and nobody had ever really done any studies up there. And it really wasn't until the transatlantic test of 1921 that really proved that some of the upper frequencies are actually useful beyond 1.5 megahertz, and maybe they shouldn't have given the hams all those frequencies to start with. The number of hams, however, once they started licensing, dropped dramatically, something like 10,000 down to about 1,200. So it almost killed amateur radio. However, you know who was real happy about that was the Navy and commercial interest, because you know what? They really didn't want any amateurs on the air anyway. After all, they'd been, cussing at them, and they'd been sending the Navy ships on false missions. They really didn't need the amateurs mucking up their frequencies. Shortly after that was the International Radio Telegraph Convention of 1912. And this was at an international level, and it established the first international call sign prefixes, replacing 3-letter call signs prevalent then. And major world powers were given single prefixes such as N and KDA to KZZ, only half of the Ks, and W for the US. Germany got AD and the rest of the Ks. F and UAA and UMZ went to France. Of course, we know that UAA to UMZ is now Russian. B, M, and G of Great Britain. Britain still got to this day M and G. B was now for China. This convention was signed in London on July 5th, 1912. However, these really applied to commercial stations and really didn't apply to amateurs. And the reason for that was amateurs were considered to be fairly low power. A lot of the commercial stations were running up to 500,000 watts of power, and maybe the most powerful U.S. station might have been running up 600 or 700 watts if they had a really big transmitter. So they really didn't have a lot of range. They didn't really apply any of these call signs to amateurs at the time. If you take a look at the ARRL convention call sign assignments, you'll see a lot of these call sign assignments are still the same today. Not a lot has changed other than new countries being added and whatnot. For example, SA to SMZ is still Sweden. Brazil is no longer SNA to STZ. Let's see here. Where's the British India is now just regular India. And anyway, so take a look at it. A lot of this is still the same today, a full 100 plus years later. On May 9th, 1913, the official U.S. policy on radio for amateur radio call letters was published, and it said that in essence, and this is really the beginning birth of U.S. amateur call signs. The call letters for amateur stations will be awarded by radio inspectors, each in his own district, and there were 9 radio inspection districts at the time, 1 through 9. Respectively, according to the following system. The call sign will consist of 3 items: the number of the radio district, followed by 2 letters of the alphabet. For example, if you were coming out of Seattle, which was the nearest radio district office, you'd be 7, and then you'd be AA or AB or AC, etc. The territory it talked about the 3 items, the given figure first, followed by the 2 letters of the alphabet, would give you a total of 598 different call signs. And it actually indicates in there will probably suffice for the amateur sending stations in most districts for some time to come. In other words, they didn't see any reason why there would ever be 598 amateurs in one of the call districts. Well, that wound up being a little short-sighted. It didn't take very long to exceed that. Radio inspectors will insert amateur call signs according to a system, and keep a permanent chart, basically a giant grid chart hanging on a wall. So basically it was a very early spreadsheet to keep track, and when some guy lost his call, they could erase it and assign it to somebody else right there on the spot. When a station is abandoned or canceled, they could reassign it. And also it says if the entire 598 call signs have been exhausted, radio inspectors will issue additional calls consisting of the figure of the district followed by 3 letters. Now we have our 3-letter suffix that we still use today. And And of course, you couldn't have SOS, you couldn't have PRB, which has to do with traffic handling. You couldn't have any QRs or QSs, and other things that would be considered to be objectionable, and that is still pretty much enforced today. So let's take a look at the U.S. Radio Inspection District in 1912, and you can see that a lot of the density in amateur radio population, or radio population in whole, is over here on the eastern seaboard, and a lot less sparse out here in the western U.S. But you think of what the U.S. was like in 1912, right? Most of the population was living back here, and this was still considered to be kind of the wild, wild west. And a lot of the radio operators, the majority of the radio operators in the U.S. worked for Marconi and manned the Atlantic seaboard stations right along the eastern seaboard. So most of the radio operators were right along up in here, which is why there's a lot of density in call signs in this area, and of course a lot less when you got to the East Coast or even down south. Then on April 7th, 1917, it all changed again. And go back and think in your minds of what happened on April 7th of 1917. Well, what happened was the U.S. officially enters World War I. We finally got dragged into the war. For the first half of the war, the U.S. had been neutral, finally joining the action in April of 1917. And, the military went back and thought about it and decided that open airwaves were considered to be a threat to national security. And so by executive order, all light radio licenses, including amateur licenses, commercial licenses, everything, were canceled, not suspended, not put aside, but they were actually canceled during the remainder of World War I. Radio itself became a monopoly controlled by the government and was going to be used strictly as a war instrument. Not only was amateur radio dead, but commercial radio was dead also. The only people that could use the radios were the U.S. government. Not only transmitters, but also receivers had to be dismantled. You weren't allowed to even have a radio receiver. It had to be, all antennas had to be taken down. And by the way, to ignore this was considered to be an act of treason. You could probably guess what the penalty for treason was back then. This is a little example of a Boy Scout book at the time telling Boy Scouts to take down their wireless. And it explains that was by an executive order of the president. Every scout should dismantle his apparatus immediately. This means taking down of the antenna wire and disconnecting and packing the instruments. The scouts should not only dismantle their own apparatus, but report to local police department any stations aside from those they know to be government stations which are in operation. So once again, they took this very seriously. However, radio amateurs were encouraged by the ARRL to aid the war effort by volunteering to man the Navy's patrol stations along the coast and enlist as radio operators, and a lot of them did. When World War I finally ended on November 11th of 1918, there was a lot of people were very happy. However, think about it, amateur radio is dead. It's gone. So I don't imagine the hams were very happy. There was no amateur radio. There was no commercial radio until a while later. So let's switch now to the reconstructive years. This is where really amateur radio rises from the ashes. When the war was over and they decided to reinstate amateur radio, which, by the way, the military really argued against. They really wanted to keep it for themselves. They had to assign all new call signs, retake all the tests. Starting in early 1919, any old call signs you had were lost. As I mentioned, the Navy really argued the Department of Commerce, who was running all licensing of radio stations at the time. This was long before the FCC, to really keep amateurs off the air permanently. And it's only due to the ARRL's actions that we were able to get amateur radio back. When they did finally reopen the inspection stations and AMs were able to go in and retake their tests and get their licenses, a lot of them camped outside the radio inspection offices to try to get low suffix assignments or even get their old call sign back before somebody else got it. So have things really changed that much, 112, 113 years later, right? There's a bunch of people here camped outside of an Apple store waiting for the latest iPhone to hit the market. So things really haven't changed all that much. By 1920, some districts had run out of the 1x2 call signs. They started issuing the 3-letter suffixes. For example, 1ABC, and here we have good old Oak Lane, Pennsylvania radio 380T, busy at the microphone. However, there was some reassignment of the 1x2s if you knew the right person and probably threw a little money their way or maybe a cigar. You could probably get just about any call sign you wanted. Z suffix calls, which were originally assigned only to special stations, opened up in 1925 for general use. However, they reserved the Y suffix stations. They kept those reserved for schools. Examples of those are still in force today. For example, if you're in the contest, you've heard of W6Y Yankee X-ray on the radio quite a bit. They're in a lot of the big contests operating out of Stanford University down in Palo Alto, California. And my alma mater, W6YL at San Jose State University in San Jose. So there's many of these stations are still on the air today with their original call signs. X at that time, the X suffix stations were still considered to be experimental stations and only assigned to experimental stations. And that suffix was not released for general assignment until 1977. So for anybody with a K7X call, X blank, or K7's X something else, those are calls have only been issued since 1977. However, they're still reserving the 2x3 calls. For example, KA0XTT are still reserved for experimental stations to this day. And if anybody gets a new experimental call, it'll be a WA or a KA0, and it'll start with an X. However, think of how radio technology changed between the world end of World War I and just a few years later when super heterodyne radios came out, replacing the TRF and the regenerative receivers at the time. And it was making it a lot easier for international contacts, even with amateurs, to get in force. CW transmitters had started to replace, or actually replacing a lot of the time, the old spark gap transmitters. However, hams were still not using the call sign conventions that were established for commercial stations way back in 1913. This was a full 10 years later. And amateurs are still using just the number and a suffix. So this created a lot of confusion. Here's some examples of QSL cards of the day. This is 1TL in Concord, Massachusetts. But look, here's a 1EB who's in Canada, right? I guarantee you there was a 1EB also up in the Northeast somewhere. Here's a 1CX in Uruguay. Well, I guarantee you there was also a 1CX in Canada, and there was probably a 1CX also in the US up in the Northeast. So a lot of confusions in call signs. Here's 3 Mike Victor in Philadelphia, PA. Well, here's 3TR who is in Italy. So once again, without the prefixes on there, really don't know where they are. There's still a lot of confusions in call signs. So by around 1926, they kind of unofficially, they began sticking extra letters in front of the call sign themselves. And they have these unofficial prefix U. U is for United States. So here's a 2UZK who stuck a U in front of his call. And now, by God, he's U2AZK. Well, if you're in Canada, well, put C in front, right? So Canada station could be C2AK in this example. Here's a U1SQ, United States 1SQ up in Marblehead, Massachusetts. But look, here's U3DH. This is from the 1930s, who is in Moscow, right? U was assigned to Russia. So all of a sudden now you've got a U.S. station using essentially what's a Russian call sign. So talk about confusing. Around 1927, they started deciding, well, maybe need a little more granularity on this. So we're going to stick an N in front of the call signs to denote North America. So here's an example of NU6BTO. His original call sign, as issued on his license, is 6BTO. N stands for North America. U stands for United States. So you know that he's in the United States, North America, and his call sign is 6BTO. The example underneath here is North America, Canada, 3CJ. Well, that gives you a little bit more definition on it. they decided to go ahead and use Hawaii to have stick an H in front. So HU6AJL was Hawaii in the United States 6AJL. Here's OA5BR, which OA5, well, that should be Peru, right? Well, no, that's actually Oceania, Australia, and actually in South Australia. So it's Oceania is the area, geographical area, and then the country is Australia. So hams kind of took it upon themselves and made all these kind of informal call sign prefixes. Here's EU3BN, which would be Russia, right? Europe, USSR, 3BN. So his call sign was 3BN, European, Europe, and then USSR. So once again, instead of using a U call sign, they've got EU. So boy, man, are you confused yet? Just imagine what it was like for a ham working other hams in other countries, you know, calling CQ and having a guy come back with his call sign and not really know where in the heck he is. So how are they going to fix that, right? Well, let's talk about now the pre-war years this is pre-World War II of 1927, and radio is here to stay. Well, mostly. The Washington Conference Radio Act of 1927 established our original amateur radio bands. And I'll have a separate presentation I'm going to put together sometime that's going to talk about the history of the ham bands. And it also formally put, finally, amateurs under the international prefix rules that were established 14 years earlier in 1913. So it took the US government 14 years to get amateurs under the international umbrella. It also formally assigned the US the K, N, and W prefixes. N was still going to be reserved at that time for use by the Navy. W and K were issued for civilian services. And it started in 1928, they started adding the W and the K call sign for civilian amateur use. And at that time, amateurs were adding the W or K in front of their call sign. And we'll explain the difference of where the K comes from in a second. The K call signs were reserved for US possession. So for example, if you were in Hawaii, you'd be a K6 call. If you were in the US, you would be if you were in the East-West Coast, you'd be a W6 call. So to denote the islands, whatnot, they had 7. If you were a K7, you can probably guess that you might be where? In Alaska. So the original K7 calls were issued in Alaska. The original K7 calls were issued for Hawaii. The A block letters like AA call signs or AB or AC were really unassigned until 1947, when we received AA through AL in prefixes. If you hear a US call sign using anything higher than AL, that's not legit. So our good old buddy, the voice of Flatbush here, NU2 ATZ, had to change his and buy some new QSL cards, and became officially in 1928. You can see his original one was in 1927. And by 1929, he was using the call of Whiskey 2 Alpha Tango Zulu. And by God, our current system of call sign configuration was finally established, but it took him until 1927 to finally get that finalized. So rush ahead now till December of 1941. It all changed again as the US was pulled into World War II. All amateurs were basically told to get off the air, and they suspended activity on January 9th, 1942, and for the remainder of World War II. However, they did things a lot differently in World War II than they did in World War I. They basically told amateurs to cease operation. However, they did not eliminate people being able to receive. They continued to issue operator licenses. After all, that gave the government really a bunch of guys that knew how to operate radios, and they were documented as such. So it gave them a ready pool of radio operators and technicians for the Signal Corps. You know, before they just told everybody, "Oh, guess what? You're not licensed anymore." And they came back and said, "Oh, gee, we really like some of you guys to come to work for us in the Signal Corps, but we don't know who you are anymore." Well, now all the hams kept their licenses. However, you could not get a station license. All station licenses were canceled. You could only have an operator license. At least receivers were still allowed. Remember in World War I, they had banned even the use of a receiver. But they had finally wised up in the intervening years and decided that people were actually encouraged to listen to what the enemy was up to. And a lot of people are actually able to go in and listen to what the some of the Japanese stations and European front stations were transmitting before they really got into the encryption side of things. This lasted until the war officially ended in September of 1945, and then hams were finally granted limited permission to have a station on the air, and literally on the air in November of 1945, but really only 10 meters and 2 meters to start. Let's jump ahead now to the post-war years of 1947 to 1975. And I'm really calling these the glory years of amateur radio. And probably quite a few of us that are on this call here tonight were licensed during this period. First license, I certainly was. I was licensed originally in 1974, just out of high school. By 1947, they had a thing called the Atlantic City ITU conference, reallocated some of the call sign blocks. They moved things around to where they typically are today. They gave some developing island nations their own prefixes. Meanwhile, they in the US, they moved some of the call districts around a bit to equalize ham populations. They also created this new call district called the 10th Call District, which is the zero land calls, kind of in the north central part of the United States. And they also changed the sixth land so that it was strictly California only. As a matter of fact, California, except for Hawaii and Alaska, are really the only state to have a unique number in their call sign. If you moved, you'd get a new call sign assigned to your new district, but you might be able to keep the old suffix if it was currently unassigned. So on your application, you had to go down to the FCC office, and they would look up, and if your call sign was currently, your suffix was currently unassigned, they would give it back to you again. That rule lasted until 1978 when everything went computerized. And at this time also, the U.S. possessions had their own prefixes assigned. For example, KP4 for Puerto Rico, KH6 for Hawaii, and of course KL7 for Alaska. So let's take a look at the U.S. call district pre-1947. This is back from the original one I showed you, 1912. Once again, a high concentration in the East Coast, not a lot of activity in the Midwest. A lot of states were in 9 land, and not a lot in the West Coast. The whole West was basically covered by 2 numbers, 6 and 7, including Alaska and Hawaii. But think of what happened during World War II, right? A lot of industry was built up here in the around the Great Lakes, right? The auto industry were building war machinery during World War II. And of course, the aircraft companies on the West Coast, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and McDonnell Douglas were all located here on the West Coast. So a lot of industry on the upper Midwest, a lot of industry on the West Coast. Hams tended to follow where technology was, and that was where the technology centers were at the time. They weren't no longer on the East Coast. They were in the northern Midwest and on the West Coast. So here's what the call sign district looked like after 1947. This pretty much more or less looks the same, but all of a sudden now, look, 9 land went from being all of these states to only be in these 3 states. And this whole great big 10th call district was carved out of 9. The 7 land became a little bit larger, and 6 land became a lot smaller. So of course, we are in 7 land. So all of our signs all of our call signs have a number 7 in them. In these, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states. In 1951, a new novice entry-level license class was added, right, to try to get more people into the hobby. It was originally a 1-year non-renewable, low power only CW license, had an input limit of 75 watts. And non-renewable. So if you did not upgrade to at least a general class license at the time, you're out of amateur radio, had to retake the novice test again to get your license back. The idea there was either upgrade or you can use that to test the waters. If you didn't like it, well, that's it. You were done. All of those call signs had either WN or KN prefixes. The N call sign the N in the call sign was dropped when you upgraded to general. For example, here's a KN5LAD, Jim Peckett in Sand Springs, Oklahoma. This was in 1958. And when he upgraded his call sign, he became K5LAD when he got his general. When they ran out of KN and WN calls, they began issuing Whiskey Victor calls, WV calls, and those went to WA or WB calls when they upgraded. They didn't do that very long. Also created was a new technician class license, which was a VHF, UHF experimenters class that only had privileges above 220 megahertz or megacycles as they used back then. An interesting thing happened on the for the U.S. possession. They used a W for the first letter to denote a novice. So KH6, for example, would be a Hawaii station with a general class, but if you were a novice, you were WH6. And when you upgraded, you went to a KH6. The same thing happened with Alaska. You were a WL7 as a novice, and when you upgraded to general, you lost the W and it became a K. And that worked out okay for the time. However, think about it, because the novice and technician classes, novice was an HF band, CW only, low power, and technician was 220 megacycles and above, and they could operate phone, but there wasn't a lot of equipment that worked well up there. The privileges did not overlap, so technically, you could hold two different call signs at the same time, a novice call and a technician class call. And if you lived in two different call districts, you could also have two different call signs for that. So technically, if you had both a novice and a technician class license and had houses in two different call districts, you technically could hold 4 different call signs at the same time. I asked one of the FCC guys that I knew whether or not they knew of anybody that actually did that was there at the time, and they don't recall anybody ever doing that. A lot of the snowbirds, for example, Barry Goldwater, guys are all, you know him as K7UGA, Barry Goldwater, the presidential candidate from 1964. And he actually had 2 call signs, a 3-land call for when he was in DC, and a 7-land call for when he was home in Arizona. The system lasted until about 1969, and they finally got rid of it and did not require amateurs any longer to change call signs when they moved. The first K call signs started to appear in 1947. So they had shifted, the K call signs from the possessions now to being used in the US, which is good because they ran out of W call signs. So they started issuing K signs, and some were still issuing the K call signs until about 1964 when they went to the WA calls. The 9th area was the first implement, which means the 9th call district was growing the fastest out of all the at least amateur radio wise. It was the first to implement the new K calls, so they were growing the most rapidly. By the late 1950s, early 60s, the K call signs were gone, so they started issuing WA and WB call signs. So if you hear WA7 or WB7, you know that those are call signs that originally came out of the 50s and early 60s. The WB call signs were issued from 65 until about 75. And by the mid-1970s, they started running out of WB call signs. So the FCC began recycling some old WA calls. And my first call sign I had was WN6HKP as a novice in 1974. In late 1974, I upgraded to my technician class license and became WA6HKP, which was a recycled call sign from the 1950s. So my first call was originally a recycled call sign. So you occasionally hear a WD call sign on the air. Those came out in the 8th, 9th, and call districts sometime around 1976 to 1978. Back then, you could also hear, you wonder what happened. They went from WA to WB and skipped WC and went to WD. They went to AB and then D. Well, at the time, WC call signs were reserved for RACI stations. Of course, those are not licensed at the moment. They have to use your individual call sign, but you used to be able to physically license a RACI station. They had WR call signs were reserved for repeaters. So if you had an amateur repeater sitting on a mountaintop, instead of using a club call sign or a personal call sign, they were using WR6. And I still remember from my time living in California, WR6 ABD up on Loma Prieta Mountain in the San Jose area. WD call signs were replaced with KA call signs in 1978 when it all went computerized. And there was an interesting thing that happened. You'll hear a lot of 1x2 calls. For example, my call W7VO. From 1966 to 1977, extra class licensees who had been licensed for 25 years or more could apply for unused 1x2 call signs, and a lot of them did. After 1977, you could still do that. However, the 25-year requirement was dropped. But of course, a lot of them had been used up by then. And then in 1977, also the 1x2 N call signs became available. For example, N7AA. At that time, you could also get what are called 2x2 calls. For example, Alpha Alpha 7 Charlie Radio were assigned for extras back then. So you could get either an N call. If you could, for anywhere available, you could get a W or a K 1x2 or an N 1x2. A lot of the guys you hear on the air today that have been around for a long time were recipients of these particular types of call signs. So now let's talk about the modern era in 1975. Things really start getting complicated call sign wise. There was a lot of sweeping reforms that occurred in 1975 to 1979. And in 1974, the chief of the FCC's amateur division, A. Proswalker, who was a ham, by the way, back then a lot of the FCC officials were amateur radio operators, which really made it a lot easier for us to get amateur radio activity done. At that year's Pacificon convention held down in California, floated the idea of impending changes to release these 1x1 call signs, especially event call signs that we hear on the air today, these 1x2 call signs for extras, right? Like N7 and AA call signs, and also A and N call signs. This went into effect in early 1975. However, in early 1977, there was a, because people could apply for call signs at this time, at least extra class could, an FCC employee in Gettysburg, PA, was indicted for taking bribes offered by amateurs wanting special call signs. Guys would go up there and offer him lots of money to get a particular N or AA call sign. So on February 23rd of 1978, the FCC decided they'd had enough of this, that it was time to computerize everything. And they adopted the call sign structure we more or less have in place today. Call signs were to be assigned according to class, which we still have today. You could not have a specific call assigned. Call signs were consigned consecutively and by computer. The call sign the computer picked for you was the call sign you got, period. That's still in place today. However, you're no longer required to change your call sign when you move. That's still in place today. Secondary repeater, control, and auxiliary station licenses were discontinued, so no more special repeater licenses or secondary licenses. You can't have two call signs. And here's how the call sign structure worked, and this is still in force today. For Group A, they had all the KN and W 1x2s and all the AA to AK 2x2 call signs. Advanced class, which there's not still a few of these guys around. The FCC stopped issuing these licenses, but there's still a few of them around. Were originally given the K and N and W prefix 2x2 call signs. Group C were the N call signs like N7AAA. Group D, novice class, were the K and W prefix 2x3 call signs. For example, what we're doing now, which I think are in KK7 for the latest call signs. That was originally a novice class call sign, excuse me. Well, when they ran out of so you wonder what happened. I just got my general and class license, and I'm a technician. I didn't get an N call sign. Why? Well, the reason is when they run out of call signs, they go to the next highest call sign group and start assigning call signs in that group. When they ran out of Group C licenses, which they did, they real quickly ran out of Group A licenses. They real quickly ran out of Group C licenses. So when you go and get your extra class now, if you want a new call sign or you take your general to an extra, you want a new call sign, you're actually going to be issued a call sign out of Group B. If you're a technician or even upgrade to general, you're still going to have a Group D, what used to be originally the novice class call sign. And keep in mind that no provisions are made for the issuance of AA to AL or NA to NZ 2x3 call signs. So even if you put a request in for example, AA7 AAA, the ARRL, or excuse me, the FCC will reject it. The same thing with NA7, or insert your own number in there, ABC, they will reject it. With one exception, that occurred in 1976. For 1976, as part of the Bicentennial celebration, right, the 200th year of independence for the U.S., the FCC authorized special prefixes for amateurs. And talk about confusing things. This certainly was a time of confusion to help celebrate the U.S. Bicentennial. For example, I'm W7VO. For that year, I could have used the call sign of AA7VO. Of course, you can't do that now because AA7VO belongs to another hand, right? When they went to sequential, this had to go away. If you were W6RGG, you could use the call sign of AC6RGG. I don't know that very many of the W guys actually changed call signs. If you were K7ABL, you could use AD7ABL. So they changed the prefixes to these unique A prefixes only for the bicentennial year. If you were WB6, you could use AB6. If you were KH6, you could use an AH6. And of course, they are using AH6 now. The AH6 2x2s or AH6 2x1 calls for extras are in force now. And if you're a KL7 up in Alaska, you could use AL7, a 2x3, or now of course you have AL7s, but they're either a AL7XX or an AL7X call sign, just the 1x2s. So there you have it. This lasted, by the way, until the end of 1976, when sequential call signs came out in 1978. So in conclusion, let's wrap it up here. Please take the time to appreciate the past efforts and tenacity that our forefathers and the ARRL had to ensure that the hobby we all enjoy even exists today, right? We lost amateur radio several times when they first licensed amateur radio operators in 1912. Remember I said it went from 10,000 people on the air down to about 1,000. During World War I, we completely lost amateur radio. And if it wasn't for the ARRL, I would not be here talking to amateurs today. It's because of them that we even have the hobby. And keep in mind that none of us really owns our call signs. I'm W7VO. I'm the 5th holder of the call sign that dates back to the early 1920s. And I know who all those previous owners are. And I actually have on my website, w7vo.com, I've got a history of the call sign back as far as I could trace it, and even some biographical information of the guys that held the call sign. They are really just leased to us by the FCC for our lifetime. So I'll be W7VO, and after I become a silent key, I'm sure there'll be another W7VO after I have used the call sign. So please take good care of them for future generations of hands. So with that, I'm going to say 7-3s. Thank you guys very much, and I will stop sharing and I'll open up the floor for questions.
Okay, I saw a question come in chat, so let's take that first. Barry, you there?
Okay, Jed from California wants to know when the vanity call signs came about.
They came out in the 1990s, mid 1990s. I didn't have a slide in there about that, but they came out in the first vanity call signs that came out were essentially in when the extra classes got the ability to apply for specific call signs of the 1x2s back in 1977. But vanity for everybody else opened up actually in Windows starting in 1994, I think. Okay. Any more questions? Dan, can you take me off of the view that I've got and put me back? Maybe I can do it myself. I did it myself. Never mind. Back into Valor so I can see everybody now. And hello there to Paul, KF7SOJ in Montana. I'll be seeing you, I think, in about a week from Saturday.
And I mentioned ARRL has put out a 1915 replica edition of the 1915, the very first QST ever mentioned, and the address is in the chat.
Yes, and I actually have a hard copy of that I got a couple of years ago. Not the original one, but it's a replica. For a while, they were selling that as you could actually buy it from the ARRL, not have to print it out. Really interesting of the technology that was being used back then. I see Anthony's got his hand up.
He does. Anthony,
and welcome to you.
Well, I just wanted to mention next Wednesday I'll be doing a session on vanity call signs. So come on back again next Wednesday for the vanity call sign session.
Yeah, I didn't include vanity call signs in my presentation because we pretty much all know when a lot of these guys have been around a while, when those first came out and have been, a part of the system. Like I said, they came out, I believe Anthony might be able to confirm to me, it was around 1994 or so when those came out. Is that your recollection, Anthony? Am I close?
It was early 90s, but I don't remember the exact time. I had to go back and look at that, but I'm not going to be talking so much just about vanity. I'm going to be talking about choosing a call for your vanity call sign. And I'll also talk about the calls, some of which you already mentioned that you can't ask for, that include some of the still the X call signs and the WWII 2x3s and those other calls. So that'll be coming up next Wednesday.
Okay, any more comments or questions? I see something else in chat here. Oh, there it is. Somebody put the QST download.
Okay, I don't see any more hands raised. Oh, Oscar's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Oscar.
Mike, wonderful presentation. I like it very much. But as a matter of fact, the first governor of Puerto Rico, actually named by the Congress, was Jesus de Piñero. And in the years of the 1920s, he had the call sign. He was an amateur within those years. And his call sign at that time was 4KT, 4 Kilo Tango. So that was in the early time, first governor at the same time as an amateur operator.
And he would have been, that sounds absolutely right, because once again, they didn't have distinctions for the islands back then. That's why they had to add their own. And in 1928, he would have been K4. So K4 would have been the original call sign assigned to Puerto Rico. So what you're saying fits right in with that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Barry,
Okay, any more questions? Did you guys find this enjoyable? Or is everybody sleeping?
No, very enjoyable. I think we've got something else in chat there. Barry, you there?
Nope, no more questions that I can see.
Okay.
Just
Yeah.
lots of thanks. It was a great presentation. Very interesting.
We just got another question in chat. Someone was asking why they don't issue the AAL 2x3s. If you have a reason,
My feeling is that the computer's just not set up to handle it right now. I think that's the excuse that I heard is you'd have to go in and reprogram the computer to allow that to happen. And keep in mind that the FCC computers are using are probably the still ones they were using back in the 1970s. And that's one of the reasons they haven't changed a lot in amateur licensing in a long time. That was what I heard from our FCC council was they're still using old software to run the amateur division.
Probably old hardware too.
I imagine, yeah. I don't think they have the latest and greatest, that's for sure.
this is the list of restricted call signs that I'll be showing next week. That I thought I'd bring that up. This is the examples of the groups that are not available for selecting as a vanity call sign.
Interesting. We'll look forward to
Yeah, there's actually an article that I found, which I just found yesterday because I wanted to get more information about the Bicentennial Calls. I actually remember using my Bicentennial Call back in 1976, and half the people didn't know about it, right? If they read about it in QST or an ARRL member, they knew about it, but if they weren't, they didn't know about it. And all of a sudden, they thought people were just making up call signs. There's actually an interesting article here, and I don't know if you can. Well, so I'm using a background, you can't see it, but there it is. Well, anyway, it's called an overview of amateur call signs past and present. And I actually found information on the Bicentennial Calls because I had to and this actually goes into a little bit more of the nitty gritty detail than I did. I mean, there are a lot more of those Bicentennial Calls because every single territory had a unique prefix assigned. That was an A prefix. So, I mean, talk about trying to keep track of stuff. I just, gave you examples of the KNs and Ws and WAs and WBs, but think of what there were for all the US possessions. It actually was quite an extensive list. There were probably, I think, 80 different unique prefixes. If you were a prefix hunter, boy, 1976 was a great year, and there'll be prefixes there that you'll probably never, hardly ever be able to work again. But anyway, that was something I just put that into my presentation this afternoon.
Mike, I added the link to that document in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Overview of amateur radio call signs past and present.
Yep, that's it. So really a well-written article. I hadn't, I got all my information by researching other places and looking at the original FCC documentation, which is where they got all their information here too. So anyway, it's a very interesting. Give you a little bit more. It's about a 5 or 6 page, no more than that.
6
1, 2,
pages.
3, 4, so about 6 page long. Matter of fact, the reference sheet is almost a full page in itself. So really to research this stuff takes quite a bit of effort. And it took me close to 6 months to be able to put this presentation together.
Wow. It shows. Very well done. Very well done.
Up there it is right there. So if you really want some more depth on it, you can get this article written by Rick Palm and Phil.
And change the thermostat.
Okay. Looking for more questions here. Hands up.
Nothing else in the chat, Dan.
I see that. It's, you know, Florida's got flies. Anyway, nothing, no hands up. Well, Mike, it's been a pleasure. I see you made it through the board of directors meeting in TAC.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be headed there. I'm going to be headed, just to give you guys a little quick ARRL update. I'm going to be headed to Newington after I come back. If I ever get to Montana and back again, depends on if the flights get canceled. I'm going to be headed to Newington on the 12th, and we're going to be interviewing a new candidates for the ARRL treasurer position, and also interviewing, I believe it's 3 companies that are going to want to take over the management of the FCC portfolio. I see we've got another hand up here from Jim Trotton, WAHUB.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I got my novice and tech the same day in about I think it was in 1964. And so I had 2 licenses. I had a WN8 HUB, and I also at the same time had WA8 HUB, which is the one I kept, of course. Anyway, it was just interesting because I took both element 2 and element 3 of the exam at the same time. So
So you had 2 call signs, yeah. And if you had lived in 2 different places, you could have had 4 call signs.
I know, but well, I only live in one place. So anyway, I just thought I'd pitch in and toss that out to how things happen.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you're the first person I've talked to that actually did that.
Interesting.
Okay, anyway, so things are going to be covered in the board meeting, which I put into actually I put it into, it's going to be going into to my bulletin going out to the Northwestern Division. But there's going to be a hopefully the passing of what I'm calling the Clean Signal Initiative, which is a new program that I'm getting the ARRL to get involved in the standards business. Of establishing technical standards for transmitting equipment, both amplifiers and transmitters. And you'll be hearing a lot more of that as we go on. I've got an 11-page white paper that will be attached to the motion we're going to be talking about. This was put together by a consortium, which included Rob Sherwood. I mean, you guys may know him, and also Ward Silver, N0AX, and myself. Put this white paper together along with a couple of the guys, the more technical guys on the board, and presented the white paper to the Program of Services Committee, which accepted it. And now I'm turning this thing into a board motion. So keep your ears tuned for what for this thing called the Clean Signal Initiative. It'll be a new ARRL program, and essentially gets the ARRL into the technical standards business. Think about IEEE has IEEE standards. There are standards. SAE has their own standards. The automotive industry has standards. Well, the ARRL is going to establish their own standards as well, and probably run them through the IEEE. So they'll be co-banded as IEEE standards and also ARRL standards. But anyway, so just a little tidbit there. Keep that in the back of your mind as we move on. I see another hand up of Larry KI6 BKP.
In Manchester, go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, yeah, I'm unmuted. This new standard, is this because of some of the cheap Chinese equipment that's come out that are less than adequate as far as QA?
No, where it came from originally was people complaining on the air that of very wide chirpy CW signals. and coming out of fairly new equipment or with a lot of key clicks. And if you look at the FCC standards, amateur radio is meant to be self-policing. So if you look at the FCC standards, there's basically just one rule, has to do with the maximum limit or the maximum limit for spurious emissions, which is 43 dB below the mean power of the carrier, right? And that's it. Nothing below that matters. Well, they can do a lot better than that. And what they're doing is, and when FCC lab tests amateur radio equipment, you'll see that they give you a bar graph, right, with a little, red area at the bottom and a green area at the top, and where that transmitter happens to be is somewhere during that. Well, what the what the Clean Fuel Initiative is going to do is have the ARRL lab work with a bunch of industry people and also the manufacturers to establish a pass-fail criteria for amateur radio transmitters and for amplifiers for phase noise, intermodulation distortion. The VMOS amplifiers and MOSFET amplifiers are inherently noisy. If you have fast switching times on CW signals, they wind up being key clicky and with extra artifact emissions in them. And the idea is to try to clean all that up through regulation by first establishing standards. Secondary is having the manufacturer's equipment tested to those standards and certifying the equipment, that it meets this new IEEE/ARRL standard. And then third of all is an education program through the ARRL education program to, damn it, teach hams how to use their radios, right? How to set the ALC on an ICOM 7300 so that you don't wind up with a wide signal, then one that splatters all over the place. If you look around a lot of YouTube videos, you won't find very many videos about how to use your radio. And just think what's going to happen if RM 11828, the technician enhancement proposal, passes the FCC, and all of a sudden now you've got this flood of new technicians going out and buying HF radios and getting on digital, and getting on FT8, and they have their mic gain cranked all the way up because nobody taught them to do otherwise. So, and they wind up with these big white signals and splattering all over the place. So it's going to be a three-pronged approach. It's going to be setting standards, it's going to be testing to those standards, and the third is educating amateurs on how to make their radios continue to meet the standards going forward. So, like I say, keep your ears perked as this perks through. This is something I personally am pushing through the ARRL, and I'm very proud to be doing that at the moment. So we'll see if it's going to be voted on at the board meeting. I'm giving them a presentation on the Thursday night. They're going to have a special general session of the board where I'm going to be presenting the Clean Fuel Initiative to them formally in preparation for a vote on the program on Friday. So you guys got a preview.
Look at that. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Any questions on that?
I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't see any hands up. It's been
I'm going to interrupt and say thank you very much. That was very, very interesting.
Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and drop off here now and say 7-3 to everybody. And maybe it might rain here in Newington. I don't know. So I better get going. You never know. And you think the sun would go down by now, but it certainly you know what got me going on this was you, Oscar, sitting there in your on Puerto Rico with your waving palm trees in the back.
Well, thank you, Mike. We'll
Anyway,
see you from Saturday, hopefully.
Yeah, and I'll see you at the airport. And let's hope the flight doesn't get canceled. But if it doesn't, if it does, I'll let you know. But as far as I know, I'm still on tap. I'm giving a keynote address at their dinner gala at the Garden Hotel in Billings that night. I'm looking forward to that. 7-3s, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Happy New Year to you. Take care.
All right, take care.
Okay, and unless there's anything more from everybody here, we'll shut this down. Remember that you can come right back again afterwards after we shut it down and visit, sit around, talk to each other. Have a good evening.
Dan, real quick for the people that are on the planning committee, you should have received a link for the slideshow preparation for March 31st.
Okay.
And Oscar, if you haven't seen it yet, you're going to enjoy the artwork. He's gone.
Yeah, he's gone. Well, Barry did too, so those East Coast guys just can't hack it, you know? All right, 73s, everyone. Have a good one. Gonna be back.
Take care, Dan. Have a good night. Good day tomorrow.